Engine repair 2, test 6, coolant and cooling systems. Coolant is water and
glycol.
yeah, except in so many cases nowadays there's other stuff besides ethylene glycol, like propylene glycol and other stuff. So it's not always ethylene glycol. But that's D is the right answer on that. We got 33 questions here. We're going to try to work our way through them because we got engine repair stuff coming. Okay, as the percentage of antifreeze in the coolant increases, what happens? A, the heat transfer increases. B, the freeze point decreases up to a point. And C, the boiling point decreases. All of the above occurs. Actually, the freeze point decreases up to a point. Now, we were talking the other day, and Willie discovered this firsthand, of how when you splash something like alcohol on your hand, it gets cold because it evaporates really fast. But that's because alcohol got such a low boiling point. If you splash something on your hand like brake fluid or antifreeze, it feels warm. You notice that? Brake fluid makes your hand feel warm, so will antifreeze. Not hot, but it makes it feel warm because the boiling point on those two things are really high. So if you got something with a high boiling point, it makes your hand feel warm, and if you got something with a low boiling point, it makes it feel cold. Adding a chemical to make ethylene glycol bitter to the taste is called A, refractometer, B, passivation, C, embittered, or D, electrolysis. Embittered has got to be the right answer for that one. I don't know. So they don't want it to taste good. You know, some people that are alcoholics will do that. Asian red coolant is what type? It's actually, hybrid organic acid technology. Isn't that what it stands for? Am I wrong about that? Okay. And do we have any cars around sitting on our place that have red coolant in them? Yeah. That little red Solara out there, it's got red coolant in it. If you take the radiator cap off and look in it, you'll say, "Man, that's red. What's that doing in there?" You know. But they got red, and there's all kinds. There's purple and yellow and all other kinds of coolant. You know, they're coming from all over the world and using different colors. In this country, we typically made it green or orange. You know, but green was what it was for years. And how can you tell? Just because the coolant is green in the radiator doesn't mean that it's safe for the winter, right? You know, you go by the color of it, that's okay. But I have known of engines freezing and busting the block, and the water that runs out of there when it melts is pretty green. You know, so you got to be careful to make sure that you check it with a refractometer or a hydrometer or something, so you'll know what's in there instead of just guessing at it because of the color of it. Although most of us just guess at it because of the color. Dexcool is what kind of coolant?
Oat.
That's oat, organic acid technology. And so PHOAT coolant is what color?
Dark green.
And that's, listen to him, dark green. Let's see, Dexcool is A, propylene glycol, B, ethylene glycol, C, silicate and phosphate free, and D, both B and C.
D.
That's actually going to be a D, but I was always under the impression that Dexcool was propylene glycol. That's interesting. Silicate and phosphate free. But so if it's orange, Dexcool is the orange coolant, and the green coolant is ethylene glycol. You know, do you like the have you used a lot of the orange coolant enough to like it or dislike it, or what?
I've always ended up with green.
Yeah, or there's some that they say will fit anything. They'll just mix with all of it. But I've got my pickup and my car both use yellow, like Motorcraft Gold coolant, and so I put whenever my vehicle tells me the coolant needs to be changed, if it's at 60,000 or 100,000 or whatever. On my truck it was 100,000, on my car it was 60,000. I changed the coolant at that mileage because that's a smart thing to do, man. Yeah, look at the mileage in your maintenance guide. See, that's the difference between a Ford and a Chevrolet and a Dodge and these little Asian and European cars. Usually, the people that drive Asian and European cars are really sticklers for checking every box in that book. I mean, they're going to check all them boxes. They're going to make sure they got all that work done. But if they're driving a Ford or Chevrolet or Dodge, they think they ought to be able to beat the daylights out of it and never change oil, and it ought to last 200,000 miles. And if it don't, it's a piece of junk. You know what I mean? But that little Asian car, they got a vision for it. This car is going to take me 500,000 miles before I trade it in. Well, see, they know that if they want that to happen, they have to be very diligent and maintain it exactly the way the manufacturer said. So they change the coolant, they change this, they do that, they check off all the boxes, they have every service done, all that kind of stuff. And they, I mean, I don't know at the times when I was working at the dealership, you know, for German or Asian cars, I mean, they would bring those things in, and you better do all of this stuff just right and check their book off so they could make sure that it was all done. And they were really, really fastidious about that. But see, the domestic manufacturers got to make them so they'll just put up with any kind of abuse, just about, you know. And all right, so here we go. Let's see. 2 technicians are discussing testing coolant for proper pH. Technician A says coolant has a pH above 7 when new and becomes lower with use in an engine. Technician B says oat and HOT coolants have a lower pH when new compared to the old green IAT coolant. Which technician is correct? That's actually C. Both of those guys are right. Reusing old coolant is generally not approved by vehicle manufacturers with the exception of Mercedes. Believe it or not, Mercedes doesn't mind you reusing the coolant. Number 10, a voltmeter was used to check the coolant, and a reading of 0.2 with the coolant engine off was made. Have you ever checked volts in the coolant? That's strange, don't it? Go to your ground, dip your probe from your meter in the radiator, and just see what the voltage is. And why would you can check brake fluid that way too. So what do you measure, and what is that telling you when you're measuring voltage there? If you measure really high voltage there, that's electrolysis that can happen and start rusting away the inside of your block. You see? Did you know what an anode is? Like on an aluminum boat that goes out in the salt water, they've got these gray things you see that they've got on the back that are isolated from the body of the boat, and they're mounted usually at an angle like that or whatever. Those are called anodes, and what they do is, if it's an aluminum boat, that electrolysis in that seawater, of course the seawater is a little bit acid, you know, eats these anodes away and leaves the boat alone. If you don't have anodes on an aluminum boat, you're going to go out there and you're going to find out one day it has eaten up, the electrolysis is, you know, carried away enough aluminum ions to where it's eating holes in the side of the boat. So you're protecting this thing. Now you can find on the internet radiator caps that have anodes built onto them, so that the anode will dissolve and and the inside of your engine block won't rust away. See, the long and short of it is, a reading of 0.8 volts was measured with the engine running and all electrical accessories turned on. Technician A says the coolant should be flushed to solve the galvanic activity. Galvanic meaning like, you know, galvanized, you know, because of metals coats. Technician B says the ground wires and connections should be inspected and repaired to solve the electrolysis problem. Number 10, that's B, but the reason is it's got higher voltage with everything turned on. So you need to make sure you got a good ground on there. There's the Harrison. All right, number 11, Dex Cool coolant is composed mostly of what? It says ethylene glycol. That's D, actually, believe it or not.
Ethylene glycol.
Ethylene glycol. Technician A says used coolant should never be recycled. Now, I'm going to go so far as to say that the author of the textbook actually wrote these questions in this test and everything, I guess. I guess he did. I need to get a hold of the guy and see if he did. But I know the guy that wrote this textbook. He's a friend of mine. Technician A says coolant should never be recycled. Technician B says coolant types that include Dexcool or ethylene glycol based. And so who's got that? That's B right there. You can recycle coolant, but it has to be filtered and treated right, you know. Which mixture of coolant water solution below is recommended for general automotive lube? 50-50, 70-30. Yeah, that 13. That's basically A, but there are some vehicles that take 70-30. So pay attention to your book when you're doing that, because if it takes 70-30 and you do 50-50, you won't be doing it according to the way they built the vehicle, right? And
is there really a danger?
Not real. Well, if you pour it in there straight, then it turns to jelly at about 8 below zero. You know, and it'll mess your motor up. Matter of fact, there was a time several years ago, when Ford fouled up and was putting straight coolant in a lot of their pickup trucks, and they started cracking cylinder heads because they had straight coolant in it. And so they actually had to, recall a bunch of those and, bring the coolant mix right. The best thing you can put in there is a 50-50 mix. And also the best thing, and I did this on my car when I changed the coolant out on it, I replaced it with a 50-50 mix of gold coolant and distilled water that I bought for that purpose. You see, so distilled water is what you're supposed to use instead of just, tap water. This stuff we got coming out of the faucet over here, it looks clean, tastes good when you drink it out of the water fountain, but you see all them calcium deposits on the water fountain pan. You're getting a lot of nice minerals when you're drinking this water around here, So, a lot of places are like that. And I tell you something else too. Rust can be so fine that it can go through just about any filter. I've never seen, like you may see this on, and I mentioned it to somebody the other day, farmers that'll have a gas tank that they had, Billy Bob the welder build them, and they put gas in it, in big bulk, and then they pump out of that tank, can get rust out of that tank. Because, if you put gas in there and it can breathe, there's going to be a water vapor in there, it's going to condense in there, and you're eventually going to start have a rust on the inside of the tank. And then they pump it into their, mama's Expedition or whatever she's driving, and then she starts having trouble. And then when you pull the fuel pressure regulator out of the fuel rail, it's all clogged up with rust, because that rust is so doggone fine, it'll come through the fuel filter. And it'll stop up the fuel injectors and all that. So, that rust is really hard to stop every last little particle of it because it can be so tiny. Let's see. All of these are functions of coolant except what? A, corrosion inhibitor. B, coolant system lubricant. C, rust inhibitor. All of these are functions of coolant.
All of them are.
All of them are. All of them. A late model, huh?
But it says except.
I know. It messed up. All of them are functions. There's not an except there. A late model vehicle's coolant is being tested. A refractometer reading shows a freezing point of what? Look at the picture.
I'm going to say -5.
What's the freezing point of that? You see it? Okay. Huh? What are you talking about?
No.
Look on the right and the left. Ethylene glycol, propylene glycol. What do you think? 15. Actually, that's C. 14. Well, it's ethylene glycol. Is what you're looking at there. It's on your ethylene glycol side of the scale. Now, the refractometer we've got will also check battery acid. Believe it or not, you can drip it on there and look at it and see what your specific gravity is. I didn't think about that when I got you that little refractometer. That little hydrometer yesterday. Upper radiator hose collapses when the engine cools. When the engine cools, the upper radiator hose gets flat. What's the most likely cause? A, a defective pressure cap. B, a defective upper radiator hose. C, a defective thermostat. D, the spring is missing from the upper radiator hose. Okay, number 16 is going to be A. Now, everybody understand how that system works? The coolant system, it's got these radiator caps on them. Basically, what you got there is you got that little, if you see that little thing, and this is what's interesting to me, that little valve in the middle of that radiator cap should not be dangling, right? If it's dangling, then it's just letting air come and go and whatever, particularly if that surge tank is empty. But the pressure unseats that big heavy spring thing on your cap, and it pushes the coolant into that jug. And then whenever the coolant contracts, it opens that little valve in the center of the cap, and it's supposed to pull the whatever coolant it needs back out of that jug, because it can suck it out of there like a straw. And that's why I take that little radiator cap whenever we got one we're filling up and we want to make sure that it's got what it's supposed to have in it. I take that little spring and all off. I got the cap is just sealing around the top of the radiator, and I just let the coolant come and go as it needs to, and I keep some in that tank. And that way, it's real safe that way, because when you're taking that off after it's over with, you're not going to have any pressure on it. You ain't going to make a mess on the floor. How many of you guys ever filled up a coolant system and you run it for a while, and as the thermostat started to operate and it started getting rid of the air and all, it starts puking antifreeze all over the floor and making a big mess? Don't you just love it when it does that? It's great, isn't it? Well, this way that I came up with to do that you don't have that problem. You take a cap, like I got 2 or 3 of them out here, it's got that spring and all removed from it, seals around the top, and it just lets it pull any coolant it needs, get rid of any air it needs to. When it's done with all that burping, then you take that off and put your other cap on there. Make sure it's full when you do. Works real smooth. Matter of fact, Harrison did one of those yesterday on that blue Chrysler he's working on. Anyway, But if that, this is something else I want to say. I have seen these stant radiator caps. Now watch for this. These stant radiator caps that has that middle piece dangling when they're brand new, and they're not supposed to have. I've received several stant radiator caps with that middle piece dangling, and so I started trying to dig into that and figure out what's up with this, because I don't accept those. Whenever he sends me one that is dangling, I say I don't want this. I mean, the cap I'm taking off is being replaced because it's dangling like this. And so he'd come up with another one that's got the same part number that ain't dangling, and I'll get that. But the stent people say that they build some that way to keep it from building pressure and blowing seals and stuff, which sounds like hooey to me. I think they got a bunch of them out there that are just bad. And a customer that doesn't understand the operation of a radiator cap will just buy one of those, put it on his car, and think he got a good deal, But anyway, yeah, well, whatever. But what can be done to prevent air from getting trapped in the coolant system when the coolant's replaced? Pour the coolant in the radiator slowly. Use a coolant exchange machine that draws vacuum on the system. Open the air bleeder valves while adding coolant. Either B or C is the right answer. A water pump is a positive displacement type pump.
False.
Okay, what does it mean if a pump is positive displacement? That means that if that pump moves, something's going somewhere. And if you got something that won't compress, it's going to stop. But the water pump, if the water pump has got an impeller and a reaction surface that it spins close to, and if it gets choked down where it can't move any water, it's still going to spin. It's just going to make air. You know what your windshield washer pump is, and all your little windshield washer reservoirs? It's got a little plastic impeller in there that just kind of whirls around. You can stop up that thing, and that pump will still run. Stop up that pinch of hose, and that pump, that washer pump's still going wee. Even if it can't put anything anywhere, it's still going to go wee. If it was positive displacement, it would stop. You understand what I'm saying? Unless it had some sort of relief valve or something. So like a jack, this jack out here that you pump on the handle on the jack and it raises the car up, that's a positive displacement pump. See, when you move that handle, something's going somewhere, that kind of thing. So just always remember that. That's why hydraulic pumps are typically positive displacement. And you can install a hydraulic pump out and just stop it if it can't send anything anywhere. Let's see, what diagnostic code could be set if the thermostat is defective?
128.
128. We've seen a couple of those here lately. Which statement is true about thermostats? The temperature marked on the thermostat is the temperature at which the thermostat should start to open. That's the correct answer there. That's where if it's 196, it's supposed to begin to open at 196. Technician A says the radiator should always be inspected for leaks and proper flow before installing a rebuilt engine. That is 100% correct. I'll tell you something else. If you're putting a motor in one, you know what I'm talking about, and we're putting that used motor in that truck out there, if we do what we're supposed to, then we would sell these people a radiator too. They need a radiator. If it's got 165,000 miles on it and it's got a radiator to come in it, they need a radiator. Them little plastic radiators, they drive that thing down the road and that radiator gets old and tired and that hot plastic splits and all the coolant gets gone. It's adios muchachos for that motor. It's gone. So it's really a good idea if you got a lot of miles on a car to start thinking about putting a radiator in it. Put some money aside. Every 10,000 miles you put aside $10. By the time you get 150,000 miles, you got enough money to buy a radiator. Doesn't take that long. If you don't take that money out and spend it on something else in the meantime.
Would that be the cause of water disappearing?
If you see, if water doesn't, no, that's going through the head, that's going past the head gaskets. If you ain't find a leak nowhere, and water's getting gone out of your motor, and it's going by the head gaskets, typically. That's a head gasket problem, ordinarily. Let's see. Number 21, technician B says overheating during slow city driving can be caused by defective electric cooling fan. He's right. Number 21, A says a radiator should be inspected for leaks. B says overheating can be caused by defective electric cooling fan. Something else you need to be thinking about too. You can look at the front of a truck. Well, pay attention. You can look at the front of a truck, and you look at the radiator, the condenser, the air conditioner, and it looks not that bad. It ain't filthy, it ain't dirty, but you can take a radiator loose and separate it from the condenser, and you'll see that thing loaded with dog kennels and all kinds of trash. And that stuff can go right through that condenser and get clogged in that radiator and make one overheat. So if you got one that's overheating, think about checking to make sure you got good airflow through your radiator. Don't assume you see everything you need to see just looking in there by the fan and looking in the front. You need to open them up and look, because we've seen them here. They're running hot, and some of them will only run hot with the AC on whenever you got that kind of situation, because heat's getting trapped in there in them dog fennels and, you know, all that kind of thing. It's really cool nowadays. They've got these infrared guns, you know, how I got a temperature gun, but they also got an infrared thing with a screen where you can see a picture of what you're pointing it at, and it lights up, you know, kind of like RoboCop's thermograph or whatever, you know, so you can see what's hot and what's not. That's slick, and it's really handy to be able to use that kind of thing. Okay, let's see. Customer complains the heater works sometimes, but sometimes only cold air comes out while driving. Technician A says the water pump's defective. Technician B says the cooling system could be low on coolant. Who's right about that? B is right about that, basically, but I will tell you this. If you've got one that's trying to overheat on you, and you got that hose, that's the bypass hose, basically it bypasses through the heater core now, and you crank that thing up, and you feel that hose going to the heater core, and it's cold, and you know it's full of coolant, you probably got water pump issues. Either the impeller's rusted away, the reaction surface has been cavitated, and I have seen the impeller on some of these Dodges. It's plastic, but it's got an aluminum center in the middle of it that goes on that hub. I've seen those things spin on the hub. As a matter of fact, I had a little video I made of one where I could just take it and just spin that impeller on that hole, the pulley, you know, hub, and spin the impeller with my finger, you know. And of course they had put a radiator in, a whole bunch of other stuff trying to get it. You want to pull the water pump off, there was your problem right there, you know. Another thing that happened, your bearings wear out in your water pump, like on these Pontiacs and stuff. It's got a 3.1 in them. If those bearings wear out in that water pump, and that pulley, it's an inside-out pulley, you know, it's got that smooth on the outside. Let's say the pulley's dragging against the water pump housing because the bearings are shot, but it ain't leaking. A lot of times you may see that. You replace the water pump, now it's running hot, but it wasn't running hot before, and you know you got all the air bled out. Well, typically, if you look at that, and I got one out here that we had, I mean, I got the part back here, the timing cover has got that reaction surface for the water pump impeller, and that water pump impeller, that 3.1, is cast iron. I mean, it is a hoss. I mean, it's got real thick blades, and if it gets in there next to that aluminum reaction surface, they can just machine it away if those bearings are gone. Well, you put a new water pump on it, now all of a sudden you got, doggone, 1/8 of an inch. And you're supposed to have like a real tiny amount of space in there, like 70 thousandths of an inch. You got too much space between the reaction surface and that water pump impeller. It's not going to move coolant like it should, and it's going to run hot. Now, one time back in 1984, I put a water pump on a Dodge Slant 6 Plymouth Valari that belonged to the guy in the business. I was working at Lincoln Mercury, and I popped that thing on there. It was leaking, you know, and I put it in with water, just got a water pump parts house, threw it on there. Now, the reaction surface on that pump was on the pump, not in the timing cover. You got to pay attention to how they're made. And so the thing used to run down real close to cool, but after I put the water pump on there, it was running up in the middle. So he comes back in there and he says, "What do you think about that?" I said, "Well, I don't know, looks okay to me." And he goes, "No, it was running cooler than that before." So I pull the water pump back off. Well, I pulled the water pump back off, and I had another water pump sent over there from the parts store, and the water pump impeller, when it was pressed on, they remanufactured it, wasn't pressed on far enough. And I had a lot of space between the impeller and its reaction surface, and on the new pump it was a lot closer. You got me? And when I put that one on there, it ran cool again. Little stuff, just little stuff. You see what I'm saying? You're not going to hear this anywhere else, except from me, okay? Or unless you read some of my motor age stuff, you'll read it, because I've talked about it in there. All right, so Technician A says the purpose and function of the cooling system is to maintain proper engine operating temperature. Technician B says the water pump's defective. That don't make any sense. That was a bad question, wasn't it? No, I'm kidding. Technician B says the water pump controls engine coolant temperature by operating at rated opening temperature. Huh? To allow what? That's not the water pump. That's a crazy thing, isn't it? Yeah, the thermostat. So number 23 is going to be A only. Technician A says cooling fans are designed to draw air through the radiator to aid in the heat transfer process. Technician B says drawing the heat from the coolant transfers heat to the outside air through the radiator. And that's right too, you know, that's 20. Let's see. Listen to this, fellas. If you got one that's an overheater, it's got an electric cooling fan on it, and they say it overheats, you know, when I'm driving down the road, but it does okay when I'm sitting still. Usually it's the other way around, isn't it? Isn't it? Usually the opposite. The coolant fan ain't working, but you hear the coolant fan running. And they say, well, my cousin Billy Bob replaced the coolant fan. No, I know. And then you look and it's one of those kind that comes without a connector on it, and they've had to hook the wires up to it. And then you find out when you put newspaper in front of the radiator that it's blowing into the radiator instead of pulling air through it. I got it wired up backwards. And you wire it up backwards so it's blowing into the radiator. It may cool it pretty good whenever it's sitting still, but when it's going down the road, the air is going to fight it. And then you're going to have, overheating situation. So pay attention to which way. If you put a piece of paper there, it ought to be pulling air through the radiator, not blowing it through it. Yeah, if it's blowing it through the radiator, the fan's wired up backwards. You'll see that too. Hey, here's another thing. If somebody doesn't know, wants to hook the coolant fan up directly to the ignition switch, this is really crazy. You'll switch the car off and pull the key out, and the engine's still running until the coolant fan stops, and then the engine shuts off. Because the momentum of the coolant fan is running, keeps putting voltage in there, and it keeps the engine alive. And that kind of thing, you just got to think outside the box to find it. It's really interesting stuff. Let me see here. Let's see. Technician A says the automotive water pumps a positive displacement. We already talked about that. Technician B says the coolant mix should be 50-50 split between antifreeze and water, and that's 25. That's B. Which of these is the right procedure to use when refilling an empty coolant system? Fill the block and 1/2 of the radiator with 100% pure antifreeze and fill the rest up with water. Is that right? No. Fill the radiator with antifreeze, start the engine, drain the radiator, and refill with 50-50 mix of antifreeze and water. What about that? Determine capacity, fill the coolant system halfway with coolant and the rest of the way with water. And then finally, fill completely with antifreeze with a 50-50 mix in the overflow bottle. The best answer and I don't like it because we don't do it that way, and it's just stupid to do it that way, because how do you determine when if you determine it at the coolant fill capacity, and let's say the coolant fill capacity is 8 quarts, and you put 1 gallon of water in there, and then you're going to follow her up with a gallon of coolant or vice versa, sometimes you won't get a 50-50 mix that way, because I've actually seen it where it wouldn't take the coolant capacity. You know what I'm saying? You pour it in there, you pour a gallon of coolant in there, and then you try to add a gallon of water, and you get about 2 quarts of water in there, and it's full. Now what are you going to do? That's a dumb way to do it. Take your jugs like we do. We take 1 jug that's halfway full of water, right? And we pour antifreeze out of the jug into that one, fill it up. That's a 50-50 mix. Then we fill the other one up. Now we got 2 gallons that are 50-50 mix, or however many you need if you do it that way. Then when you pour it in there, you know you're getting 50-50 mix. This silly nonsense about filling the motor halfway full and then putting the rest in it, that's a bunch of hooey there. I want to talk to him about that. All right. For each gallon of fuel used, moisture equal to how many gallons of water is produced? 1 gallon of water for each gallon of fuel, guys. Believe it or not, you produce 1 gallon of water for each gallon of fuel. That's why steam comes out the pipe on cold days. An automotive engine that's running at too high of a temperature will have which of these? A, excessive oil consumption. B, high oxides of carbon. C, poor coolant system lubrication. D, high thermal inefficiency, and that's A. It can burn oil. It also makes oxides of nitrogen more. Water pump which uses which of these reactionary forces to circulate the coolant? Centripetal force, magnetic force, centrifugal force, or gravitational force? That's C. It uses centrifugal force. Got it? All right. Now, if a coolant system operates too cool, the engine will A, produce more torque, B, pre-ignite or detonate, C, produce higher emissions, or D, have more efficiency. 30, it's going to produce more emissions on that. Which one of these areas is the water jacket?
That would be B.
That'd be B. That's around the cylinder, right? And in the head. Head's the hottest part of the vehicle anyway. All right, hottest part of the engine. In this drawing of a radiator cap, what's occurring within the cooling system?
Coolant is returned to the radiator.
What do you think, y'all? You like that? Coolant's returned to the radiator. Good answer. Number 33. The use of coolant recovery machine is helpful in preventing what from entering the cooling system? Air. And if air gets in and out of there whenever it wants to, you're going to have a lot of corrosion. And that concludes our test for today. You guys get good information out of that?